The farmhouse sat dark against the November sky, 30 yards inside enemy lines, and the 5 men crouched in the ditch wore Wehrmacht greatcoats over their American uniforms. Sergeant Callahan pressed his face into the frozen mud, watching German soldiers smoke beside a half-track parked in the courtyard. His breathing came shallow through the captured helmet that sat too tight on his head. Behind him, Private Hooper whispered something about the coal scuttle design digging into his skull, but Callahan raised one gloved hand for silence. The plan had seemed simple back at battalion. Walk through the checkpoint wearing enemy coats, reach the bridge, mark coordinates for the artillery. But now, lying here with German voices drifting across frozen ground, and his dog tags wrapped in tape so they wouldn't jingle, Callahan could smell his own fear mixing with the wool and diesel smell of the enemy coat. One of the soldiers by the half-track turned, and for 3 heartbeats Callahan was certain the man was staring directly at him. Then the German flicked his cigarette into the darkness and went back inside, and Callahan's fingers loosened slightly on the captured Mauser he carried instead of his M1. What I'm going to tell you today, well, it might surprise you. Before we go on, make sure to subscribe so these stories don't get lost to time. The kind of missions that never made it into the history books, but deserve to be remembered. Hit that button, and let's continue. The idea had come from Colonel Patterson 3 days earlier, delivered in a tent that smelled of kerosene and wet canvas. Callahan had been cleaning his rifle when the runner appeared, saying the colonel wanted to see him personally. That alone had set off warnings. Colonels didn't usually call for staff sergeants unless something had gone sideways or something dangerous needed doing. Patterson had been standing over a map table when Callahan entered, his reading glasses reflecting the lamplight. He'd looked up slowly, studied Callahan's face for a long moment, then asked a single question. "You speak any German?" Callahan had learned it from his grandmother in Pennsylvania, the old woman who'd come over before the First War and never lost her accent. He could order beer, ask directions, understand conversations in shops. He'd mentioned it once during induction, thinking it might get him assigned to intelligence. Instead, he'd spent 2 years carrying a rifle through North Africa and Sicily, like everyone else. Now Patterson wanted to know if he could pass for a German soldier in the dark, from 20 feet away, long enough to get through a checkpoint. Callahan had swallowed hard and said he thought so. Patterson had nodded once, then told him to pick 4 men he trusted and report back at 0400. The 4 men Callahan chose were sitting in a supply tent when he found them, playing cards on an overturned crate. Hooper was a farm kid from Iowa who never complained and could walk all night without slowing. Davis had been a mechanic in Detroit and could fix anything that had an engine. Kowalski was a Brooklyn kid who'd grown up fighting and knew how to move quiet. And then there was Jensen, a quiet Norwegian from Minnesota, who barely spoke unless spoken to, but who had the steadiest hands Callahan had ever seen. They'd all been with him since Sicily. They'd all saved his life at one point or another. When Callahan told them what Patterson wanted, the tent went silent. Davis set down his cards slowly, staring at nothing. Hooper scratched the back of his neck and asked how they were supposed to get German uniforms. Kowalski just laughed once, short and bitter, and said, "We're gonna die, aren't we?" But Jensen leaned forward, his pale eyes calm, and asked what the mission was worth. Callahan told them the truth. There was a bridge 12 miles behind enemy lines, a crossing the Germans were using to bring up armor and supplies. If artillery could hit it, the whole offensive in this sector would stall. Jensen nodded slowly and said, "Then we go." The uniforms had come from a captured supply depot, sorted through by intelligence officers who measured them against Callahan's men like tailors. The greatcoats were wool, heavy and scratchy, still smelling faintly of whoever had worn them before. The helmets were the worst. The German coal scuttle design sat different, heavier on the back of the skull, and Callahan could feel it pulling at his neck every time he moved. They'd practiced walking in formation in a clearing behind the line, an intelligence lieutenant watching them with binoculars, calling out corrections. Hooper's stride was too long, too American. Kowalski slouched too much. Jensen moved perfectly, like he'd been born wearing the uniform. They'd been given forged papers typed on German forms that intelligence had been collecting for months. Each man had a name, a unit designation, a reason for being on the road. Callahan was now Feldwebel Steiner, a supply sergeant moving between depots. The others were his detail, reassigned after their unit took casualties. The lieutenant had made them memorize the details until they could recite them in their sleep. Then he'd given them one last piece of advice, delivered in a voice that carried no warmth. Don't get caught. If the Germans realized they were American soldiers in enemy uniforms, they'd be executed as spies. No trial, no prisoner exchange. Just a wall and a firing squad. The last thing Patterson had done was pull Callahan aside, away from the others. They'd stood in the cold November air, breath steaming, and the colonel had asked him one more question. You know why I picked you for this? Callahan had said no. Patterson had looked at him for a long moment, then said something that didn't make sense at the time. Because you've done this kind of thing before. Callahan had started to say the colonel was mistaken, that he'd never been on an infiltration mission like this, but Patterson had just shaken his head and walked away. The comment had bothered Callahan all through the night, sitting in his foxhole, trying to understand what the colonel meant. They'd crossed the line just after midnight, moving through a gap in the wire that a patrol had marked 3 nights earlier. The ground was frozen hard enough to crunch under their boots, and every step sounded like breaking glass in the silence. Callahan led them in single file, following a compass bearing, stopping every 100 yards to listen. Twice they'd heard voices in the distance and gone flat in the mud, waiting. Once a flare had gone up somewhere to the south, casting everything in cold white light, and they'd frozen like statues until the darkness returned. By the time they reached the checkpoint road, Callahan's legs were shaking from tension, not cold. The checkpoint itself was a wooden gate across the road, flanked by sandbag positions and a small guard hut with light showing through gaps in the blacked-out windows. Callahan had watched it through binoculars from 200 yards out, counting soldiers, noting routines. There were 4 guards visible, maybe more inside the hut. A truck had come through while they watched, stopping at the gate while a soldier checked papers. The whole thing had taken maybe 3 minutes. Then the gate lifted and the truck rolled through, taillights disappearing into the darkness. It looked routine. It looked manageable. But Callahan's hands had been sweating inside his gloves anyway. The plan was simple because complicated plans fell apart in the dark. They would walk up to the checkpoint in formation, papers ready, moving like men who had every right to be there. Callahan would do the talking. The others would stay quiet, looking bored and cold like soldiers everywhere. If the guards suspected anything, if anyone asked a question Callahan couldn't answer, Kowalski would make a distraction, and they'd try to fight their way out. Nobody said what would happen if that failed. They all knew. They'd all seen what happened to prisoners the Germans thought were spies. They'd started walking just after 200, boots loud on the frozen road, and Callahan had forced himself to keep his shoulders back, his stride even, his face expressionless. The checkpoint was a quarter-mile ahead, a yellow glow in the darkness. Beside him, Hooper was breathing too fast, and Callahan had muttered in German, "Slow, steady, like you've done this 100 times." Hooper had nodded but didn't slow his breathing. Davis kept touching his pocket where his fake papers were folded. Only Jensen seemed calm, walking with his hands loose at his sides, his face showing nothing. Callahan had wondered, not for the first time, what Jensen had done before the war. 50 yards from the checkpoint, a dog started barking from somewhere behind the sandbags. Callahan's stomach dropped. Nobody had mentioned a dog. Dogs could smell things humans couldn't. Fear, unfamiliar soap, American tobacco. The barking got louder, more aggressive, and Callahan heard a German voice shouting at the animal to shut up. A shadow moved near the guard hut, and a soldier stepped out into the road, rifle in his hands, watching them approach. The man was young, maybe 20, and he looked cold and annoyed. He didn't look suspicious yet. Callahan kept walking, kept his face neutral, and hoped the dog would stay chained. When they were 20 feet from the gate, the young soldier raised one hand. "Halt!" Callahan stopped, the others stopping with him, and he could feel sweat running down his back despite the cold. The soldier came closer, holding his rifle casually, and asked where they were going. Callahan answered in German, his grandmother's accent thick in his mouth. They were supply detail, moving between depots, orders from division. The soldier looked them over, his eyes moving from face to face, and for a terrible moment Callahan thought he saw recognition there, some instinct saying these men weren't what they claimed. But then the soldier just sighed, held out his hand, and said, "Papers." Callahan reached into his coat, moving slowly, and pulled out the folded documents. His fingers felt numb. The soldier took them, unfolded them under a flashlight, and Callahan watched his eyes move across the typed lines. Behind the soldier, another guard had appeared, older, a sergeant maybe, watching from the doorway of the hut. The dog was still barking. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled. American guns miles away. The young soldier looked up from the papers, looked at Callahan's face again, and asked one more question. "Where's your unit now?" It was a test. Callahan knew it was a test. And he also knew that if he got the answer wrong in the next 5 seconds, everything would fall apart. Callahan named a town 15 kilometers east, one the intelligence officer had circled on a map and made him memorize. The young soldier stared at him, processing, and then nodded slowly and handed back the papers. He waved them through without another word, and the gate lifted with a creak of frozen wood. Callahan walked past him, keeping his stride even, and heard his men's boots following behind. They were through. They were inside enemy territory, wearing enemy uniforms, and there was no going back now. The gate lowered behind them with a dull thud, and Callahan didn't look back. They walked for 20 minutes in silence, following the road as it curved through dark forest. Callahan kept listening for pursuit, for shouting, for the sound of an alarm being raised, but there was nothing except the crunch of their boots and the whisper of wind through bare branches. When they were far enough from the checkpoint that the lights had disappeared behind them, Hooper let out a breath that sounded like he'd been holding it the entire time. Kowalski muttered something in Polish that was probably a prayer. Davis just shook his head slowly, over and over. Jensen said nothing at all. The bridge was supposed to be 8 miles ahead, across farmland and through a village the Germans were using as a supply hub. Intelligence said the village had maybe 20 soldiers stationed there, rotating guard shifts, checking convoys that came through. The bridge itself was stone, old, crossing a river that ran deep and fast this time of year. If the artillery could collapse it, the Germans would lose their main supply route for this entire section of the front. But first, Callahan had to get close enough to mark the coordinates, and that meant walking through the village in broad daylight, because the bridge was guarded and there was no other way. They found a barn just before dawn, empty except for rotting hay and the smell of animals long gone. Callahan posted Jensen at the door to watch the road while the rest of them tried to rest. Nobody slept. They sat against the wall in their German coats, weapons across their laps, and waited for sunrise. Hooper unwrapped a frozen chocolate bar from his rations and tried to eat it, but his hands were shaking too hard to break off pieces. Davis cleaned his rifle, the only sound the soft click of metal parts being reassembled. Callahan watched light grow in the gaps between boards and wondered what Patterson had meant about him doing this before. The memory came slowly, reluctantly, like something he'd buried on purpose. France, 1918, when Callahan had been 17 and lied about his age to enlist. He'd been assigned to an intelligence unit, not infantry, because someone had noticed his German language skills during training. They'd sent him across the line twice, dressed in captured uniforms, carrying forged papers, walking through enemy positions to gather information. He'd been terrified both times. He'd also been good at it. Good enough that his commanding officer had recommended him for officer candidate school. But then the war ended. Callahan went home, and he'd spent the next 20 years trying to forget what it felt like to walk among enemy soldiers, knowing one mistake meant death. Patterson must have found the records, dug through old files, seen the commendations Callahan had never mentioned to anyone. That's why the colonel had picked him. That's why Patterson had looked at him with that knowing expression and said, "You've done this kind of thing before." Callahan should have felt angry about having his past dragged up without permission. Instead, he felt something else. A strange, cold clarity, like muscle memory returning after years of disuse. He knew how to do this. His body remembered even if his mind had tried to forget, and that knowledge might be the only thing keeping his men alive. When the sun was fully up, they left the barn and walked toward the village. The road was busier now. A Wehrmacht truck passed them going the opposite direction, the driver barely glancing at them. A farmer with a cart pulled by an exhausted horse moved to the side to let them pass. His eyes down, his face carefully neutral. Callahan could see smoke rising from chimneys ahead, and his chest tightened. This was the dangerous part. In the dark, At a checkpoint with bored guards, they could pass. But in daylight, in a village full of soldiers, one wrong word or wrong gesture would expose them. They entered the village just after 800, and it looked like a dozen other French villages Callahan had seen. Narrow streets, stone buildings with shuttered windows, a church with a damaged steeple. But now there were German signs on the walls, Wehrmacht vehicles parked in the square, and soldiers everywhere. Two sat outside a cafe smoking, their rifles leaning against the wall. Another walked past carrying a fuel can, not even looking at Callahan's group. The normality of it was almost worse than combat. These men looked relaxed, safe, like they owned this place. Callahan forced himself to look the same way. Just another supply detail passing through. Nothing remarkable, nothing worth noticing. They were halfway through the village when the motorcycle appeared. It came fast down the main street, engine roaring, and skidded to a stop directly in front of them. The rider was a lieutenant, young but with hard eyes, and he killed the engine and climbed off in one smooth motion. He looked at Callahan's group with immediate suspicion, the kind of suspicion that came from an officer who'd survived by trusting his instincts. He asked what unit they were from, and Callahan gave the rehearsed answer. The lieutenant listened, his expression unchanging, then said something that made Callahan's blood go cold. That unit was dissolved last week. I signed the paperwork myself. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Callahan could feel his men tensing behind him, hands drifting toward weapons, ready to fight their way out even though they were surrounded by 24 German soldiers and had nowhere to run. The lieutenant's hand moved to his pistol holster, not drawing yet, but ready. Callahan's mind raced through options and found nothing good. Then Jensen stepped forward, spoke in perfect German with a Berlin accent Callahan had never heard him use before, and said, "We were reassigned before the dissolution order came through. Administration error. You know how division is." The lieutenant looked at Jensen, really looked at him, and something in Jensen's face or voice or bearing made him hesitate. The lieutenant asked for their transfer orders, and Callahan's stomach dropped again because they didn't have any transfer orders, just the original forged papers. But Jensen didn't hesitate. He said the orders were being forwarded. They'd been told to report to the supply depot at the bridge and collect them there. It was a reasonable lie, the kind of bureaucratic confusion that happened in every army. The lieutenant studied Jensen for a long moment, and Callahan could see him weighing whether to press the issue or let it go. Finally, the lieutenant said, "I'm going to that depot myself. I'll ride with you." It wasn't a request. They walked toward the bridge with the lieutenant beside them, his motorcycle pushed by hand because the street was too crowded with supply trucks. Callahan tried to think of a way out and found none. When they reached the depot, when there were no transfer orders waiting, when the depot commander had never heard of them, it would be over. They'd be arrested, searched, and within minutes the Germans would find their real dog tags underneath the uniform. Callahan glanced at Jensen, trying to communicate something with his eyes, but Jensen's face showed nothing. Just that same strange calm, like he'd expected this and had already calculated the odds. The bridge came into view through the buildings, gray stone arches spanning dark water, guarded at both ends by sandbagged positions and what looked like a mounted machine gun. Callahan had to get coordinates, had to find a landmark he could use to call in artillery, but the lieutenant was right there watching them. They passed a supply truck being unloaded, soldiers carrying crates marked with German stenciling. A sergeant shouted at a private who'd dropped something. Everything looked organized, efficient, routine. Just getting close enough to mark the bridge felt impossible now, let alone getting away afterward. The depot was a cluster of wooden buildings on the far side of the bridge, surrounded by stacked supply crates and parked vehicles. The lieutenant led them directly to the main building, pushed open the door, and called for the depot commander. Callahan's hand drifted to his pocket where he'd hidden a small compass, the only thing he might use as a weapon if this went bad. Behind him, he heard Davis breathing hard. Kowalski had gone very quiet, the way he always did before violence. An officer emerged from an inner room, a captain, older, with a tired face and ink stains on his fingers. The lieutenant explained the situation, and the captain listened, then asked to see their papers. Callahan handed them over, knowing it was pointless now. knowing the captain would check a roster or make a phone call and find out their unit didn't exist. But the captain just glanced at the papers, barely reading them, and handed them back. He told the lieutenant that transfer orders were backed up everywhere, division was a mess, and if these men said they'd been reassigned, then they probably had been. The lieutenant looked frustrated but didn't argue with a superior officer. He mounted his motorcycle, gave Callahan one last suspicious look, and rode off. The captain watched him go, then turned to Callahan and said something that made no sense. "You boys did good work. Patterson sent word you were coming." Callahan's mind went blank. Patterson sent word. That meant the captain was, what? An informant? A collaborator? Someone playing both sides? The captain saw Callahan's confusion and smiled, tired and sad. He said in English, quiet and careful, "I was Wehrmacht, 1918, captured by Americans in the Argonne. Your people treated me well. I've been repaying that debt for 3 years now." He told them he'd radioed their coordinates to the American line an hour ago, that the artillery strike was scheduled for noon, and that they needed to be at least 2 miles away when it started. He also told them to ditch the German uniforms as soon as possible, because if they got caught wearing them after the bridge went down, even his help wouldn't save them. The walk out of the village felt surreal, like moving through a dream where reality had bent into something unrecognizable. They passed German soldiers who nodded at them, walked by guard posts that waved them through, and nobody stopped them. Jensen had saved them with his perfect German and cold nerve. The captain, whoever he really was, whatever his story was, had saved them again. But they weren't safe yet. They still had to get back across the line, still had to survive the artillery strike that would bring every German soldier in the area down on this section of the front, and they were still wearing enemy uniforms with American dog tags hidden underneath. They found a drainage ditch 2 miles north of the bridge and went to ground, stripping off the German coats and helmets and burying them under dirt and leaves. Underneath, they wore their American uniforms, wrinkled and stinking of sweat, but suddenly feeling like safety. Callahan checked his watch, 11:47, 13 minutes until the strike. Around them, the countryside was quiet, almost peaceful, and it was hard to believe that in 13 minutes this whole area would erupt in fire and destruction. Hooper was smiling for the first time in 3 days. Davis kept touching his uniform like he needed to confirm it was real. Kowalski said he was never wearing another German uniform as long as he lived. At exactly 1200, the first shells came in. Callahan heard them first, that distinctive whistle growing louder, then the shattering impact that made the ground shake. He raised his head enough to see smoke rising from the direction of the bridge, black and thick. More shells followed, a steady barrage, and through it all he could hear the deeper crump of heavy explosives finding their target. The bridge would be gone. The supply route would be cut. The mission was complete. All they had to do now was get home. Jensen had pulled out a map and was tracing a route with his finger, showing Callahan a path through forest that would keep them away from roads. His finger stopped at a particular spot, and he looked up, his pale eyes meeting Callahan's, and said, "We should talk when we get back." They moved through the afternoon, staying off roads, moving through tree cover and along creek beds. Twice they heard German vehicles in the distance, probably rushing toward the bridge, and they went flat and waited for the sound to fade. As the sun dropped lower, Callahan kept thinking about what Jensen had said. "We should talk." There was weight in those words, meaning beyond the surface. Jensen had spoken German like a native, had handled the lieutenant with the ease of someone trained in deception, and had shown no fear even when everything was falling apart. Callahan wasn't the only man in this group with a hidden past, and whatever Jensen had done before the war, whatever had brought him to that quiet farm in Minnesota, it was something Patterson probably knew about too. They crossed back through American lines just after dark, challenged by a nervous sentry who almost shot them before recognizing their uniforms. The password got them through, and they walked into camp like ghosts returning from the dead. Word had already spread that they'd made it. The artillery strike had been observed, the bridge confirmed destroyed, and battalion was calling it a significant success. Men they barely knew clapped them on the shoulders as they passed. A cook pressed hot coffee into their hands without asking, but Callahan just wanted to sleep, or maybe just sit somewhere quiet and let the tension drain out of his body like water from a cracked cup. Patterson was waiting in his tent, standing over the same map table, the same lamp burning. He looked up when Callahan entered, and there was something in his expression. Not quite pride, not quite relief, but something deeper and more complicated. He asked if everyone made it back, and Callahan said yes. Patterson nodded slowly, then dismissed the other officers in the tent with a wave of his hand. When they were alone, he poured 2 cups of whiskey from a bottle he kept in a footlocker and handed one to Callahan. They drank in silence for a moment, and then Patterson said, "I read your file from 1918. All of it." Callahan set down his cup, feeling the whiskey burn in his chest. He asked why it mattered now, why Patterson had dug up something from 25 years ago. The colonel studied him over the rim of his cup and said, "Because men like you don't just disappear. You went to ground after the First War, became a farmer, tried to forget. But the skills don't leave, the instincts don't fade. And when this war started, you enlisted as a private, when you could have walked in as an officer." Patterson paused, swirling his whiskey. "That tells me you were running from something, or hiding." Callahan wanted to argue, but found he couldn't. Everything Patterson said was true. After 1918, he'd gone back to Pennsylvania, bought 40 acres, and spent 2 decades trying to become someone else. He'd married a woman who died of pneumonia in 1938. He'd raised chickens and corn and never talked about the war. When the draft started in 1940, he could have avoided it. He was too old, technically. But instead he'd enlisted, given a fake birth date, and requested infantry, not intelligence. Not anything that would require him to think about walking through enemy lines in a stolen uniform. He'd wanted to be anonymous, just another rifleman in a vast army. But Patterson had found him anyway. The colonel refilled both cups and told Callahan the rest. Jensen wasn't his real name. It was Jaeger. And he'd been born in Berlin, emigrated with his family in 1935 when he saw what was coming. He'd worked for British intelligence for 2 years before Pearl Harbor, then volunteered for the American OSS. Patterson had requested him specifically for this mission, knowing Callahan would need someone with real expertise in deep cover work. The quiet Norwegian farmer from Minnesota was actually a trained spy, who spoke 5 languages and had spent 3 months in occupied Poland, gathering intelligence before escaping through Sweden. The army had hidden him in an infantry unit, waiting for a mission that required his particular skills. Callahan felt something settle in his chest, a puzzle piece clicking into place. That's why Jensen had been so calm, so capable. That's why he'd handled the lieutenant without breaking. He'd done this before, probably dozens of times, in places far more dangerous than a French village. Callahan asked if Patterson had told Jensen about Callahan's past, and the colonel nodded. He said Jensen had read the file the same night Callahan had picked him for the team. That's why Jensen had accepted the mission so quickly, without hesitation. He'd known he wasn't going out with an ordinary staff sergeant who'd gotten lucky. He'd known Callahan was someone who understood the work. The tent flap opened and Jensen himself stepped inside, still in his mud-stained uniform, his pale eyes moving between Patterson and Callahan. The colonel gestured for him to enter and poured a 3rd cup. Jensen took it, drank, and said in English without any trace of a Norwegian accent, "We should have talked sooner. Would have made things easier." His voice was different now, sharper, more precise, with hints of education and training that the farm boy persona had hidden. Callahan asked why he'd kept pretending, and Jensen shrugged. He said it was safer for everyone if his real background stayed buried. Too many questions otherwise. Too many people wanting to use him. They talked for an hour, the 3 of them, about missions that would never appear in official records and skills that armies needed but rarely acknowledged. Patterson told them there would be more operations like this one. The war was far from over, and men with their particular talents were valuable. He also told them they could refuse. Nobody would force them back across enemy lines if they didn't want to go. Callahan looked at Jensen, and Jensen looked back, and something passed between them that needed no words. They'd both spent years trying to hide from what they were good at, trying to be normal soldiers in a normal war. But that wasn't who they were, and pretending otherwise just wasted what they could do. Callahan said he'd go on the next mission, whatever it was. Jensen nodded and said the same. Patterson smiled slightly, the first real expression Callahan had seen from him, and said he'd expected that answer. He told them to get some rest, that there would be a briefing in 3 days for something in Belgium, something that would require them to disappear into enemy territory for a week. Then he dismissed them, and they walked out into the cold November night, where stars were visible between clouds, and the distant rumble of artillery marked where the war continued without pause. Hooper, Davis, and Kowalski were sitting outside their tent sharing a cigarette. They looked up when Callahan approached, and Davis asked if everything was all right. Callahan said yes, and it wasn't a lie. For the first time since enlisting, he felt like he was in the right place doing the right work. The farm in Pennsylvania seemed like another lifetime, something that had belonged to a different man. This was who he was, someone who could walk through enemy lines and come back alive, someone who could lead men through impossible situations and bring them home. He'd spent 25 years running from it, but maybe Patterson had been right. Men like him didn't just disappear. Jensen sat down beside the others and someone handed him a cigarette. He smoked in silence, his face thoughtful in the dim light, and Callahan wondered what he was thinking about. Berlin, maybe, or the family he'd left behind when he emigrated, or the missions he'd run for the British that had probably come within inches of killing him. Whatever his thoughts were, he kept them private, and after a few minutes he stubbed out the cigarette and said he was going to sleep. The others said good night, and Jensen disappeared into the tent, leaving the 4 of them sitting in the darkness. Hooper broke the silence, asking if the next mission would be as bad as this one. Callahan said probably worse, and that got a nervous laugh from all 3 of them. But they didn't say they wouldn't go. They'd all been through enough to know that some jobs required people willing to do them, and if Callahan was going, they'd follow. That was how it worked. That was how they'd stayed alive this long: trust, loyalty, and the knowledge that the man giving orders understood what he was asking. Kowalski said he'd follow Callahan into hell if necessary, and Davis agreed, and Hooper just nodded because words weren't needed. The camp settled into quiet around them, just the usual sounds of an army at rest. Canvas flapping in wind, someone coughing in a nearby tent, a generator humming somewhere in the supply area. Callahan sat with his men and felt something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. The mission had worked because Patterson had known who to send, had dug through old files and found the right people for the right job. And now there would be more missions, more trips behind enemy lines, more moments where one wrong word meant death. But Callahan wasn't afraid of it anymore. He'd remembered who he was, what he was good at, and why that mattered. After a while, the others drifted off to sleep, leaving Callahan alone under the stars. He thought about the German captain at the depot, the one who'd helped them because an American soldier had treated him well 25 years ago in the Argonne. War was strange that way, full of circles and echoes, debts repaid across decades, and small kindnesses that rippled forward through time. Maybe that's what all of this was about, in the end. Not just the tactics and the violence, but the human connections that persisted even when everything else fell apart. The captain had saved them because someone had saved him, and now Callahan would lead other missions, take other men behind enemy lines, and maybe somewhere down the road that would matter to someone in ways he'd never know. He stayed outside until the cold drove him in, then crawled into his bedroll and closed his eyes. Sleep came fast, heavy and dreamless, the kind of sleep that comes after surviving something that should have killed you. When he woke in the morning, there was frost on the tent canvas and his breath steamed in the air. Jensen was already up, cleaning his rifle with methodical care, and when Callahan sat up, Jensen glanced over and said, "Belgium's going to be harder. Steeper terrain, more patrols, worse weather." Callahan said he knew, and Jensen smiled slightly and went back to his rifle. They understood each other now. No more pretending, no more hiding. Just the work ahead and the knowledge that they were good at it. Patterson appeared at noon with maps and photographs, spreading them across a table in the command tent. The mission was exactly what he'd promised. Deep penetration, 1 week behind enemy lines. Objective classified until they were briefed in full. Callahan studied the terrain and saw mountains, forests, villages that would be crawling with Wehrmacht. It looked impossible. It looked like the kind of operation that got people killed. And when Patterson asked if they were ready, Callahan didn't hesitate. He said yes. Jensen said yes. And just like that, they were committed to the next mission, the next infiltration, the next trip into enemy territory wearing stolen uniforms and carrying forged papers. Because that's what men like them did. That's who they'd always been, even when they'd tried to forget. Stories like this one, they remind us that heroes don't always look like heroes. Sometimes they're just ordinary men, farmers, mechanics, quiet kids from small towns, who carry something deeper inside them, something that emerges when it's needed most. If you want more stories like this, the kind that honor the men who served without asking for recognition, subscribe to this channel. These stories deserve to be remembered. And if this one meant something to you, leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, take care of yourselves.